Third and last talk for the Shaffer Lectures this evening. As you know from the prior two nights' introductions, Dr. Eric Barreto is the Frederick and Margaret L. Weyerhaeuser Professor of New Testament at Princeton Theological Seminary. And beyond his academic publications, Professor Barreto also takes seriously his service to students and communities in the Guild. He has been on the board for the Louisville Institute and has been an active mentor advocate in many spaces, including the Louisville Institute, the Wabash Center for Teaching and Learning, and the Hispanic Theological Initiative. He is also beloved among our community of New Testament scholars. I took the liberty of tapping a couple of our mutual good friends for a commentary to include in this introduction. I am, after all, giving the third introduction, so I have a bit of comedic freedom. These are anonymous, and I'll let Professor Barreto guess their identities. Very brief. The first friend I asked was too curmudgeonly to offer anything useful, but gradually attested to their long friendship. And the second mutual friend, besides admiring Professor Barreto's breadth of scholarship and mentorship, also wanted to add, Dr. Barreto, great at Lucan scholarship, terrible at pool. And with that, and in anticipation of hearing more on the Gospel of Luke, let's welcome Professor Barreto to give his third lecture, Reading Luke in the Days to Come. Thank you.
Thank you all for coming out. I want to start this evening with the primary feeling I am sensing, and that's gratitude. Gratitude for the gift of appreciative, curious colleagues who ask the best questions, even behind my back, questions that help expand my imagination, gratitude for the gift of hospitality and care and logistics, and gratitude for the long and vital legacy of this school. In short, thank you for all your kindness. Yesterday, we spent time in the colonized present of Puerto Rico and thinking about Luke with the island. As I concluded last evening, my hope throughout these lectures is to make a case that we should revisit the complexities and power of our stories, the stories of struggle and failure and persistence that made our living today possible. That these stories are ingredient to biblical interpretation, indispensable to exegesis, and needed especially now when a single story of loss and resentment and grief and grievance threatens to swallow us all. In light of such threat, what can we say about the future, about hope, with Luke? Well, there was this one time that Jesus got really salty with a fig tree, at least according to Mark and Matthew. In Mark 11 and Matthew 21, we find parallel stories. Jesus sees a fig tree from a distance and anticipates picking a delicious snack. Instead, the fig tree is leafy, but without a fig to be found. A frustrated Jesus curses the tree to remain fruitless. In Mark, Jesus then proceeds to cleanse the temple, prompting the chief priests and scribes to look for a way to kill him. The next morning finds the same disciples walking by the fig tree and are amazed to see it withered away to its roots, prompting a lesson in the power of faithful prayer. And here we see one of these emblematic Markan intercalations. In Matthew, we find no intercalation. Instead, the encounter, curse, and reaction to the fig tree entirely follows the cleansing of the temple. And one more vital difference between Mark and Matthew, Mark clarifies that it was not the fruit-bearing season for fig trees, a detail that amplifies the interpretive challenges around this story. What do we make of a Jesus whose hunger overcomes knowledge of times or periods of a season? To what extent is cursing a faithful prayer, especially when the object of such a curse is a plant, presumably without agency, to choose to flower and ripen fruit? What do we make of a Jesus who cannot seemingly read the signs of the time? The questions multiply when we turn to Luke. In chapter 21, after the story of the widow's mite and Jesus' concomitant predictions of the temple's destruction, after Jesus' warnings about persecution, after the promise of the coming of the Son of Man in a cloud with power and great glory, Jesus turns to a fig tree. Then he told them a parable. Look at the fig tree and all the trees. As soon as they sprout leaves, you can see for yourselves and know that summer is already near. So also, when you see these things taking place, you know that the kingdom of God is near. Truly, I tell you, this generation will not pass away until all things have taken place. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away. Here there is no curse of the fig tree, and Jesus' knowledge of the seasons is attuned to the cycles of the tree. The fig tree, and indeed all trees, are an object lesson. Just as you can see the seasons written in the cycles of a tree, so too can we be sure of God's future judgment and deliverance. The signs of the time are legible, and so too is the certainty of God's ancient promises. The turning of the age is coming surely and seemingly soon. For many interpreters of Luke, the delay of Jesus' return is at the heart of Luke's theological project. That Luke tamps down eschatological expectation, pushing the promised return of Jesus to a distant horizon, substituting a structure and a history of salvation in place of imminent expectation of the end. Luke's redaction of the story this story in particular, may appear to provide some backing to this approach to a delayed parousia. Jesus' fiery judgment in Mark and Matthew is blunted. The distance between the story and the cleansing of the temple increased. And yet the expectation that this generation will not pass away remains. And so too the expectation that Rome's destruction of Jerusalem is a marker of the impending judgment of God. Moreover, as Eric Smith is proposing in a forthcoming book in Semea Studies, the first readers of Luke would have been intimately familiar with the destruction of the temple Jesus describes in Luke 21. The rubble still visible, the smoke still billowing, the loss still keenly felt even with the passing of time. Luke 21 then presents a picture not of future destruction and loss, but a visceral reality in which Luke's earliest readers would be living. Luke 21, in that way, is not a hazy view into a future unseen, but the tangibility of the present. Luke 21 is about contemporary events and their theological implications for Luke and his auditors. Thus, I want to think with Luke this evening about the future, about eschatological hope, about the days to come, especially in a moment of political and theological crisis, something Luke's audience, I think, was experiencing, and that might echo our own current predicaments, both social and theological. Thinking about the future with Luke is not primarily a question of timing, whether imminent or delayed. I think thinking with Luke about the future best focuses on questions of the quotidian realities and hopes that the gospel can inspire within the shadow of empire and crisis. As Jesus tells the disciples in Acts chapter 1, it is not for his disciples or Luke's readers to know the times or seasons, but it is for them and for us to receive and exercise a certain kind of power that dawns from the Holy Spirit. Such power finds its center in everyday resistance to the encroachments of empire, resistance performed in the margins of the world. So first, plotting time with Luke. For some time, the cartographical shape of Luke's narrative has been noted by scholars. From Luke's travel narrative to the many maps that Acts helps fill out in every study Bible that you have, Luke's geographical interests are clear. His narrative maps the ancient world in a theologically striking way. Scholars have noted also Luke's related interests in mapping time as well. So Hans Conzelmann famously imagined Luke's mapping of a threefold salvation history, a chronology of God's activity which Luke weaves into his story of Jesus. And while such a schema has been significantly critiqued, I wonder if there remains some helpful exegetical possibilities as we wonder how Luke's accounting of time sheds light on the text's theological aims. Recently, Troy Troprigin has suggested that Luke is exercising a kind of time dilation by slowing down Jesus' journey to Jerusalem in order to model the way of discipleship. That is, the time the journey takes is itself emblematic of the formation of disciples, emphasizing the slow and deliberate steps faithfulness requires. Luke teaches such faithfulness not just didactically or through direct instruction, Tropigan argues, but in the very narrative shape of the gospel. And so I think it proves fruitful to think with Luke about time and how time shapes hope in the present and future alike. Luke's construction of a formative chronology is evident right from the start of the narrative. I'm thinking here of the way he synchronizes between narrative time and imperial calendars, how that framing becomes, synchronizing between narrative time and imperial calendars become frames within which Luke engages when telling the story of Jesus' birth and infancy. So, of course, a couple examples from these early chapters in the Gospel of Luke. In 1:5, in the days of King Herod of Judea, there was a priest named Zechariah. In 2:1, in those days, a decree went out from Emperor Augustus that all the world should be registered. This was the first registration and was taken while Quirinius was governor of Syria. In Luke 3:1, in the 15th year of the reign of Emperor Tiberius, when Pontius Pilate was governor of Judea, and Herod was ruler of Galilee, and his brother Philip, ruler of the region of Iturea and Trachonitis, and Lysanias, ruler of Abilene, during the high priesthood of Annas and Caiaphas. You kind of see these things building through those early chapters. In each case, the reign of the powerful helps mark time, helps tell the reader what time it is. In each case, however, the presence of empire's leaders is also a reminder of the machinery and omnipresence of empire's power. Empires set calendars and they mark history. But I wonder if we might notice that these are but the chronological frames of these opening chapters. And that within these imperial chronological frames are quotidian markers of time that are even more instructive when we think about how Luke plots time. We can see some of these quotidian markers of time when we meet Elizabeth and Zechariah, and hear again the old story of a couple's infertility. It's an old story we hear in Scripture repeatedly. But I think it's also a story many of us will recognize. There's one particular detail about time in our narrative that remained unremarkable to me for a long time. Luke 1:24-25 reads, "After those days, Zechariah's wife, Elizabeth, conceived, and for 5 months she remained in seclusion. She said, 'This is what the Lord has done for me, when the Lord looked favorably on me and took away the disgrace I have endured among my people.'" It took heartbreak to understand these brief elliptical verses. They leave so much unsaid that some among us here this evening will understand fully right away, I think. So when my spouse and I learned we were going to have a baby, we rejoiced, we celebrated, we told our parents, we imagined this new life, and then we lost that pregnancy and then another. Of course, we were devastated. We shared the news with our friends and our church, and we heard story after story that echoed ours. This was not a new story. Many of our friends, it turned out, had experienced miscarriage, and yet I remember wondering, why did no one tell us? Why did no one prepare us? Church communities know how to welcome babies, how to throw a baby shower, how to baptize and coo over the newest members of God's family. But sometimes we fall short too often in grieving what appears to be a supposedly invisible loss, but nothing could be farther from the truth. Such a devastating loss is invisible only because we do not talk about pregnancy loss enough. It is invisible because we have not created enough spaces for grieving and storytelling. So in the end, this loss changed us, it changed me. It changed how I read and teach and preach this particular story. because after those crushing losses, the story of Elizabeth and Zechariah made sense in a way I had not known before. I have to confess that I always had imagined that these biblical couples struggling with infertility had never conceived in the first place. I only later came to understand that this couple, along with so many others, had probably experienced hope and disappointment in equal measure. They had known the pain of rising hopes dashed by yet another miscarriage. They knew too well what it meant to hope and to lose, to yearn and to wait, to lose hope little by little. And so it finally made sense to me, and I finally noticed why Elizabeth would go in isolation for 5 months after she learned she was pregnant. Because maybe she didn't want to hear the whispers. Perhaps she didn't want to experience the devastation that had followed hope every time before. Maybe she didn't want to have to explain to her neighbors what had happened once again. A different world didn't seem possible to her. Perhaps she couldn't bring herself to believe what the angel had told Zechariah. And so when Elizabeth says, "This is what the Lord has done for me, when the Lord looked favorably on me and took away the disgrace I have endured among my people," in that one sentence is a lifetime of pain, a lifetime of friends and neighbors misunderstanding the shape of God's grace. But in that sentence, Elizabeth also musters a deep well of faithfulness, a river of trust in a trustworthy God. And I wonder if it's a sentence that you have voiced, and a sentence those of you who are called to serve have also spoken. 5 months then becomes 6 months. It is in the 6th month of Elizabeth's pregnancy that Gabriel visits Mary, a scene we discussed 2 nights ago. The stories of Elizabeth and Mary thus intertwined, the way they practice hope in the changing of the world deeply related. On the 8th day, another marker of time, on the 8th day of John's life, he is circumcised and named. The anticipated birth of John the Baptist arrives as promised by Gabriel, and joy abounds in this scene as Elizabeth's hopes are consummated because of God's, quote, great mercy to her. The narrative moves quickly from angelic pronouncement and conception to birth, but I wonder if preachers and interpreters might help us imagine the mix of worry and expectation that must have accompanied this couple. When the time comes for John to be circumcised, so also Jesus in 2:21, and to be named, a certain, though not specified, they move to name the child after his father. Such assumption seems to be a safe one, but Elizabeth intervenes, declaring that his name should be John, despite it not being a family name. Now, Luke does not explain how Elizabeth comes to this name. Zechariah might have communicated to her via writing and gesture his experience of the angel's message. And yet the narrative silence here might also point toward Elizabeth's attunement to God's power. For God is the primary actor in this story, so God's naming of John would, of course, be known to his mother. Zechariah confirms John's name, and the unnamed crowd is amazed, presumably because they too see God's mercy still at hand. Or we might consider the specificity of Anna's age, a distinctive marker in Luke's account, which Heidi Bierman has recently been naming in really incisive ways. Or we might consider the yearly travel of Jesus' family to Jerusalem for the Passover festival, and Jesus' specific youthfulness at age 12. Or we might consider Luke's elliptical naming of the space and time between Jesus' youth and the beginning of his public ministry. That is, as empire keeps time to coordinate warfare and economics, God's ordinary servants are keeping time with life. That is, thinking about the future is pondering the shape of time, its utility and purpose and meaning. As John Swinton has contended about our timekeeping in the West, he writes, "Time has become a commodity to be bought and sold rather than a gift to be received, cherished, and valued. It has come to be valued for its own sake rather than for the sake of love. Within such a temporal context," he continues, "those who cannot keep up with the demands of time become vulnerable." Swinton here is thinking specifically of disabled neighbors, And I think it is worth pondering who else among us is also malformed by our broken accounting of time and value. That is, in Luke, imperial time tells us when we are in the story, but it is quotidian time, everyday time, the time of births and feasts and hope and grief that tells us why, that tells us wherefore. The contrast between imperial frames and quotidian markers of time came to mind for me in my recent read of Becky Chambers' short and powerful novel, A Psalm for the Wild-Built. Anybody seen this little book? I love this book. Chambers is another author, and I'll read this in a second. Chambers is another author thinking of the intersection of the present and the future, in her case, opting for speculative science fiction. In this book, Chambers draws a world in which robots had achieved something akin to human intelligence in the distant past. And in that moment, instead of war, humans and robots agreed to separate, to part ways permanently. Humans eschew robotic technology, robots disappear into the natural world, and these two worlds live in parallels, never crossing paths, until the chance encounter of a monk who wanders in the wilderness and a robot looking to renew the connection. Go read this book. It's really great. It's short. So in the midst of these journeys, Chambers writes this: "It is difficult for anyone born and raised in human infrastructure to truly internalize the fact that your view of the world is backward. Even if you fully know that you live in a natural world that existed before you and will continue long after, even if you know that the wilderness is the default state of things, and that nature is not something that only happens in carefully curated enclaves between towns, something that pops up in empty spaces if you ignore them for a while, even if you spend your whole life believing yourself to be deeply in touch with the ebb and the flow, the cycle, the ecosystem as it actually is, you will still have trouble picturing an untouched world. You will still struggle to understand that human constructs are carved out and overlaid, that these are the places that are the in-between, not the other way around. For Luke, the empire's keeping of time is the in-between, the constructed, the curated enclave, while the quotidian time of ordinary joy and grief is the default state of things, to use Chambers' phrase. That is, Luke's timekeeping is helping us see that the way we keep time in the world is backward. And so, some acts of hope. One of my students once noted that churches often find themselves caught in an eschatological dualism between prediction and embarrassment. On one side are churches that map the end of days with chronological precision. They see the signs of the times everywhere they look. They claim to know the times and the seasons despite Jesus' warning. And on the other side are churches so embarrassed by these eschatological fables that they avoid thinking much about the end at all. Seeing no alternative to fabulous visions of the future, they opt for an unswerving examination of a present shaped by some vague, indeterminate hope of a good but indeterminate future. Both of these fall short, of course, because I think Luke's eschatology is prophetic more than predictive. It names the brokenness of the present day and explains how God's promises still resonate in their midst. Such eschatology does not plot the end. It names the author whose plot is the redemption of our bodies. So I think throughout this week, I'm trying to make the case that Luke can help us imagine hope in the future, less as a gazing to an uncertain day before us, and more a leaning into the realities of God's activity among us. An imagination to notice God's intrusion into the world as it is. A hope in God's setting right of an unjust world. Moreover, such a hope would come to understand that we are often finding ourselves catching up to God's previous acts, constrained as our imaginations are by the forces of death and illness, colonialism, racism, and the other ills that afflict us. hope in the future fulfillment of ancient promise, is not naivete, it is hard-won hope. Rebecca Solnit, reflecting on the tension activists and politicians, protesters and institutional leaders experience between calls to radical change and the slow work that institutions can do over time, writes in this way. She says, and we are impatient creatures, impatient for the future to arrive, and prone to forgetting the past in our urgency to have it all now. And sometimes too impatient to learn the stories of how what is best in our era was made by long, slow campaigns of change. Martin Luther King Jr., she says, famously said that the arc of history is long, but it bends toward justice. But whichever way it bends, you have to be able to see the arc. And I'm pretty sure by arc he meant a gradual curve, not an acute angle as if history suddenly took a sharp left. Sometimes seeing it is sudden because change has been going on all along, but you finally recognize it. And so I think that eschatological hope calls for persistent patience, but also the imagination to see the stirring of change already happening in our midst. As Nick Montfort has noted when referring to key lessons in what he calls the practice of future making, he writes, being radical and different is not by itself what makes visions of these sorts compelling. They work because they are connected to everyday known realities in the social world we currently inhabit. That is, seeing the future requires seeing the present and the past with clarity. And so some practices of hope. There is a kind of eschatology that merely delights, that promises that my enemies will be vanquished so that I will be delivered in vibrant technicolor. Such a story assumes my victory, but little else. There's a kind of eschatology that serves only to distract, to dull our senses that the world is unjust, that things should be otherwise. Such a story tells us that justice cannot be tasted today, only in some indistinct future. There's a kind of eschatology that deals only in death and its many minions. Such a story tells us that hope is a wasted luxury. But there's also a kind of eschatology that can empower, that can humble, that can remind us of the limits of human power, that can make real the unreal and believable the unbelievable, make believable the unbelievable. Such a hope for the future embraces quotidian eschatological practices. And here I just want to gesture towards some of these practices as I see them emerging in Luke. First, we can imagine the resistance of empire's arrogations in everyday struggle. Consider, as we talked about last night, John the Baptist called to the tax collectors and soldiers not to leave their booths or lay down their swords, but to live in faithful witness within their labors, to witness to life in systems of death. And think about the practice of hard-won transformative hope. Again, going back to Elizabeth's hard-won belief that the promise of a child would be true this time around. We can think of Gabriel's response to Mary's question, how can this be, which we talked about the first night. Because Mary's question, how can this be, is not just about pregnancy, but about the many promises the angel makes, promises that Jesus would see the rising and the falling of many. How can this be, Mary asks? Well, nothing will be impossible with God. This is a call to believe not just in the miracle of conception and infant life in a world where miscarriage, stillbirths, and childhood mortality would have been all too familiar. It is also a call to believe that the world could be otherwise. The practice of witness, which we have discussed a few times, especially in Q&A. So we can think of Luke 21, 12 through 13, when Jesus teaches, but before all this occurs, they will arrest you and persecute you. They will hand you over to synagogues and prisons, and you will be brought before kings and governors because of my name. This will give you an opportunity to testify, even an opportunity, we might say, to witness. The kind of witness that yearns and looks for the proliferation of life in a world so often marked by death's forces. And last is the practice of something I want to call generational hope. But to get there, I think we need to go back to fig trees. Again, we began this evening with Jesus' reaction to a fig tree. In Mark and Matthew, his cursing of the tree is set within an eschatological frame. Mark's account in particular raises questions about Jesus' attention to the seasons, further complicating our reading of the text. In Luke, the fig tree stands as an object lesson for eschatological attention. Just as natural processes mark seasons' transitions, so also does the dawning of God's intertwined deliverance and judgment make itself known to those who have eyes to see. But there is one more fig tree in Luke, which might provide yet another angle of vision on Luke's imagination for hope in the future. In chapter 13, Jesus tells a parable. A man had a fig tree planted in his vineyard, and he came looking for fruit on it and found none. So he said to the gardener, "See here, for 3 years I have come looking for fruit on this fig tree, and still I find none. Cut it down. Why should it be wasting the soil?" And he replied, "Sir, let it alone for 1 more year, until I dig around it and put manure on it. If it bears fruit next year, well and good. But if not, you can cut it down." The passivity of the vineyard's owner has struck me in reading this story. He did not plant the tree himself, nor presumably care for it. Instead, the man comes to the tree looking only for its productivity, for tangible fruit, for a positive ROI, we might say these days. I'm not even sure if the reader is supposed to believe his declaration that he waited for 3 years. Is he exaggerating? Is his testimony reliable? After all, for the owner, the tree is a drain upon the soil. Its purpose moot if it cannot flower even after 3 years. Cut it down, the man demands. But the gardener, maybe a better translation here, the vine dresser intercedes. He asks for 1 more year. 1 more year of care and activity, 1 more year of digging and feeding the soil. 1 more year, then the judgment can come. If the tree still does not yield fruit, cut it down next year, he says. But the parable makes me wonder if this is the first time that this conversation has occurred. Over 3 years has the passive, distracted, uninvested owner demanded the same of the gardener, only to be distracted by the plea for 1 more year. What if this parable points not to the assurance of judgment, but the persistence of a gardener whose hands show evidence of care, whose shoulders have felt the beating of the sun, whose hopes are measured not in productivity or even in a year, but in seasons and generations? I wonder if we are to see God not so much in the character of the disconnected landowner looking only for what the land can produce, but the persistent vineyard tender who intercedes for just a bit more time, who imagines that there is more to a fig tree than its fruit, at least today. I think the context of this parable points to these possibilities. Immediately before the parable is Jesus' reference to the kind of tragedy that prompts questions of theodicy, the reason for unexplainable suffering. Jesus points to 2 intertwined examples of such baffling events. First is the reference to Galileans killed by Pilate. The second is the toppling of the Tower of Siloam, resulting in the death of 18 people. Jesus asks about the former, "Do you think that because these Galileans suffered in this way, they were worse sinners than all other Galileans? And about the latter, about the tower, do you think that they were worse offenders than all the others living in Jerusalem?" And while there's an element of randomness or of indiscriminate tragedy in both of these cases, there is also a human element involved in these tragedies. These are not tornadoes touching the ground or an earthquake shaking it. No, what we have is the indiscriminate violence of empire alongside the failing of architecture built by human hands. In both cases, we are dealing, I think, with the frailties of human power. Such is the world Jesus imagines in Luke, an account of the world that would resonate with first century audiences left vulnerable by natural and unnatural disaster alike. Immediately after our text is Jesus' healing of a bent-over woman, prompting a debate about the Sabbath. Twice we learned that the woman's suffering lasted for 18 years. The narrator specifies the span of time as the story begins, and then Jesus repeats it at the end. That is, the context of the story of the fig tree is that of suffering. Generational suffering at the hands of forces of evil beyond the control of everyday people. The intertwined forces of Satan and the empire, as suggested by Luke's account of the temptation account and Joel Green's interpretation, that frames the parable of a fruitless fig tree. And at the heart of the parable may be a call to persistence, reflecting the gardener's and thus God's own relentless pursuit of justice. The call for one more year for the fig tree may thus not be a deferral of the owner's demand, a delaying of judgment, but a sleight of hand by a gardener who knows the soils, who has his hands deep in the compost, who loves the tree as a tree. One more year is a promise that God's patience is long, but so also are the generational hopes that have brought us here thus far. This is perhaps Luke's most helpful contribution to our eschatological imagination. To imagine that the fulfilling of God's promise is witnessed not by any single generation, but via generational memory, by a genealogy of the faithful, by those of us who already have come to know Jesus because of the witness others have shared. I am reminded here of Emily St. John Mandel's Sea of Tranquility. Just read novels. That's all you need in life. In the novel, Mandel plays with reality and time, destiny and belonging. One of the novel's characters, Olive, is a novelist living in the year 2203. Though a resident of a colony on the moon, she is embarking upon a book tour on Earth when reports of a flu pandemic begin to circulate. It is in that context that Olive wonders aloud, when have we ever believed that the world wasn't ending? The question resonates with me in the stories of Luke 13. For the victims of Pilate, for the dead crushed by the Tower of Siloam, for the woman suffering for 18 years, for the family huddled together under the threat of bombardment, for the immigrant in detention wondering if a new life will be possible, for the enslaved, for the protester facing arrest, for the person breathing their last breath. The ending of the world as we know it is not theory. It's not an abstraction. It's tangible. Recently, I heard my colleague, the theologian Dirk Smith, share his story as a scholar amid and an activist against apartheid in South Africa, including his composition of the Confession of Belhar. I asked him how he sustained hope when apartheid seemed indomitable. And he confessed that unlike Tutu's characteristic and bright optimism, Smith never believed that he would see the end of apartheid in his lifetime. So I asked him, why did you keep going? Why did you continue? He said it was because it was not his call to see the end of apartheid, but to be a witness to faithfulness in the meantime. Mandel's Olive continues, what if it is always the end of the world? Because we might reasonably think of the end of the world as a continuous and never-ending process. If it is not clear up to this point, our current context has been a critical concern for me in my reading of Luke this week. Political crises here in the United States and elsewhere in the world are destabilizing already fragile and deeply flawed democratic systems. Environmental crises increasingly feel like unsolvable challenges faced as we are by capitalist demands for certain kinds of productivity, the realities of unequal economic opportunity, and the very different vulnerabilities different communities face as the oceans rise, weather races to extremes, and wildfires rage. Theological crises proliferate as too many Christian communities foster white nationalism, as communities of faith face an unsustainable future, as Christian witness too easily falters before political pressure. These crises can often seem unprecedented. I feel like that's the media's favorite word these days. They seem unprecedented, irresolvable, simply overwhelming. In such a state of crisis, hopelessness can too easily reign. And I worry that hopelessness can become viral grievance, creating enemies of our neighbors. And such grievance so easily slips into bitter resentments that narrow the possibilities of belonging, community, cooperation, and love. Doom and foreboding are not cradles for imagination, for hoping for life. On his podcast, Ezra Klein recently contended that the opposite of doom is not hope or utopia, but curiosity and mystery. I'm not sure I would draw the line so sharply, but I do think hope and utopian imaginations are salves against doom. But I am struck by the twin urging toward curiosity and mystery. And so we might add to our list of eschatological practices the practice of attention, the practice of listening with care, the practice of noticing the remarkable beauty surrounding us, the practice of seeing attention as perhaps our most valuable resource. And it may be poets who are best suited to form and train our attention. And so I think we should give the poets the last word as we conclude our time reading Luke with time. As much as storytelling to me is a powerful medium for cultivating imagination, for nurturing hope, for helping us dream new futures, I wonder if the poets around us are the kinds of prophets we most need. So I was struck by the recent discovery of a Robert Frost poem previously unpublished, and with it we will close. The poem is called Nothing New. One moment when the dust today against my face was turned to spray, I dreamed the winter dream again. I dreamed when I was young at play, yet strangely not more sad than then. Nothing new, though I am further upon my way, the same dream again. Thank you for your attention, friends.
We thank Professor Barreto for another very stimulating lecture. We thought about the gospel through the lens of the crucifixion. We thought about the gospel through Puerto Rico, and I'm very personally pleased that you gave us a message of hope and a way of thinking about the future that's not completely despondent. So, the floor is now open, and you have a microphone. So if you, standard practice, just identify yourself quickly and pose your question. Who would like to ask Professor Morgan? Teresa. Thank you, Elisha.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much indeed for that. I really especially appreciated your interpretation of passages in terms of the hard-won nature of hope. That's really helpful. I wondered how, in that frame, you interpret the entos humon in 1721, which is, after all, saying about the nature of the kingdom, so very relevant to this whole argument you're developing.
What was the phrase again?
The entos humon, the kingdom of heaven is entos humon, however you interpret that.
That's a good question. I think, I wonder if part of what Luke is doing is expanding the sense of the us, of the we. I think didn't talk about this, but sometimes say to students that if Luke had one chapter's worth of papyrus, he gives us the bit of Isaiah in Luke chapter 4. And if he has a chapter's worth of papyrus, he gives us the parables in Luke 15, partly because of the way that they expand our sense of belonging, of who is included within the circle of people that we call we. So I wonder if by exhorting that the kingdom is among us, it's this call to see in all our stories and all their grief and all their hope, ways in which God's activity is moving among us, ways in which the Spirit is speaking to us. So maybe back to last night, thinking about Ada Maria Sazzi Diaz and her sense of the lo quotidiano, the quotidian, to expand our sense of where we find resources, is get a sense of the shape of that kingdom that's among us.
How are you putting that against the futureness that you were talking about in a lot of this lecture?
Right, so like I think it's, I'm working on this, I think, still, the sense like it's both, that there is this promise that's coming. I cut this out just to shorten it, but you know, Luke ends with the ascension, begins and acts with the ascension, and this promise that Jesus is going to come back in the same way. And if Luke is interested in deferring the parousia, that's a strange story upon which to hinge that narrative, I think. But I wonder if for me, part of it is that generational piece, the sense that people have struggled long before us, people will struggle long after us, but that those struggles aren't moot. And that there's still this sense of hope that there is this future transformation coming, but it doesn't mean that the experiences of grief and hope that we have today are somehow less than that future reality, that there is this intrusion, this invasion that's actually real and tangible, even if it's not complete. But I'm still wrestling with this. I don't quite know. I was hoping I would have more clarity by the time I finished writing it, but I'm still caught in, do you have a sense of how you would think about it?
I just wonder whether within your graph translation, which I quite like,
Oh,
because it's good pointy,
yeah.
as opposed to good transatlantic,
Oh, interesting.
might play in an interesting way.
Yeah.
However.
Well, I want to chat with you. Let's chat afterwards a little bit. Love that.
Elijah wanted to ask a question.
Kind of along the lines of Dr. Morgan, I felt like that's why you uplifted Psalm for the Wild-Built. I felt like that was kind of the thread.
Mostly because I'm a nerd, so. And I love sci-fi.
Becky
No.
Chambers, yeah, I was going to say Becky Chambers, I'm so grateful. She is incredible. In my opinion, she's like this generation's Octavia Butler. And it is really powerful when we see those with a very strong and fleshy connection to the liturgy write science fiction in a revolutionary way. And it reminds me of Toni Morrison. I don't remember the exact words of her quote, but she was saying when you finally arrive at these jobs that you're well trained to do and these positions where you can change the world, before you set about to take a moment to imagine, to dream. And that's kind of what I see Becky Chambers doing, and that's definitely what I think Octavia Butler did. So thank you for uplifting Becky Chambers.
So yeah, I wonder if there's something about sci-fi and the way that helps us dream about the future that might bring a little help us think about the kind of future making that the gospel.
Specifically when not written by cis white men. Like it's very not like Lord of the Rings. It's a totally different.
Yeah.
Chloe.
Thank you very much, Chloe Starr. I just sort of, to clarify really, why is it, or is it necessarily colonial as opposed to just imperial, the imposition of a authoritarian time? We all live in dual times, whether you're in dynastic China or, you know, theocratic Iran or just us. You have a calendar that's an official calendar, and then we have our local festivities and our local experiences of time, regional and such. So is it necessarily colonial, that other than in the particular biblical context about which you were talking today, that we all live in dual, triple frames of time?
Yeah.
Thank you.
No, I think that's right. I think that dual reality, I think, is important to name. What I'm struck by in those first couple of chapters of Luke is that close juxtaposition of these eras marked by these figures, and then these ordinary, everyday activities. And I was struck in writing this how often days are mentioned and years are mentioned. There's this precision happening there that I wonder if that contrast between the large time and the everyday time is a clue to the kind of thinking how we might think about that dual time that we all find ourselves in the moment.
Other questions? Or
I'm going to pick up on the fictional question, because I was wondering about speculative fiction and your use of it. I was thinking as we talked, and as Elisha mentioned her comment, their comment, the idea of Karen King that the hypothesis of the archons or reality of the rulers is part of the science fiction of antiquity, right? Or even something like the text of Revelation. I'm also thinking across to Michael Beth Dinkler's work and these questions about narrative theory and literary theory. I didn't know how, or if you wanted to play with that, the larger questions that are contemporaneous to the writing of Luke Acts around fiction and truth when we think of something like Lucian, how to write history, or other contemporaneous attempts to kind of map that line between forming narratives and fantasies of hope or future or even despair or questions around fiction and truth. If not, you inspired my own set of thinking.
No, I want to think more. I think I was thinking primarily of kind of contemporary thinking about the future and time, but I think that I want to revisit that and rehearse that and think, yes, I want to pursue that. Yes, thank you.
Others? We've had 3 nights of very stimulating lectures. One of the things I've appreciated, I'm just going to call you Eric, I know you, is how you've collapsed your own existential moment with your reading of the text. And I found that very refreshing. And I think sometimes we who are humanists are accused of leaving everything in an ivory tower and not making it real for where people live. But no one can accuse you of that the last 3 nights. And so it's been refreshing to hear that. And I thank you for the way that you've read Luke, because you've read Luke in a way that I confess I haven't.
Phew.
To think of Luke that way.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
So would you all join me in thanking Professor Barreto?
Thank you, friends. Appreciate it. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you all for coming out. I know this is a busy time of the semester, so I'm grateful for your presence and attention. All the best as you close the semester.
Thank you.